Hello, aviators. Welcome back again. In the first session, I had covered general briefing points, the precautions to be taken in case of COVID 19 related issues. We had discussed the pre flight procedures, how to set up the flight, and what we need to do when you're maneuvering on the ground. Before we go to the next session, a little bit about myself. I am a pilot with about 34 years of experience, initially with the Indian Air Force and recently with a scheduled airline on turboprop aircraft. I also have a little bit of flight testing experience, which I will share with you once in a while. I got a lot of feedback from the last session. Most of it was very, very constructive and encouraging. A few of the salient points which came out was that the session was more like a lecture, a little too formal, and I will try and make it a little less formal, although the subject requires that we stick to a particular pattern. So without any further delay, let us go to the next session. Today's session is about takeoff procedures, where we'll discuss the takeoff mass calculations, takeoff briefing, lineup and what to be careful about, the importance of checklists, the various segments of the takeoff, and understanding the V1 speed. Now you must remember that a lot of formal training and education has been given to you regarding all these, and I do not aim to redo the whole thing. It's just to give you some practical experiences and things to look out for when you are operating in India. When we are calculating the allowed masses, some of the requirements we consider are the lineup loss. Now this usually is accounted for in the tables given to you by the airline. However, it's always good to line up as early as possible to have additional distance available for your accelerate and stop. You need to cater for the wind and slope. Normally, the tables include these aspects also. The density, altitude, all of us know affects our performance. And if the runway condition is other than normal, wet or contaminated, you will have issues. Takeoff briefing is usually part of the pre-flight briefing. It improves the crew's awareness, knowledge, and team effectiveness, especially when special circumstances or conditions exist. And it should clearly define the duties and responsibilities of captain and first officer, as well as the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring. It should address items that could affect this particular takeoff, such as runway contamination, we discussed that earlier, hazardous terrain during the takeoff and climb out, and special departure procedures which may be published as standard or briefed for the particular day at the dispatch or by the ATC. Next, when you're lining up, a few things you need to remember. You must have positive clearance from the tower frequency for lineup on the approved runway. The approved runway should be positively identified. We all are familiar with the identifying marks, or there is no harm in relearning these and revising them periodically. You should ensure the approach path and the active runway is clear of traffic. There are times when you are given clearance by the ATC to line up behind a particular aircraft which is landing on the same runway. Once you have commenced your lineup and you are moving in, you should ensure you are clear of that aircraft, and further activities will only be done after the active runway is clear of the same aircraft or other aircraft which may be crossing at further portions of the runway. You must ensure that the stop bar lights are off. If these remain on, positive clearance is necessary from the tower to disregard these lights. And you must also be cautious about displaced thresholds. The importance of checklists and SOPs during lineup cannot be overemphasized. There are a lot of activities which have to be done here, which are specific and mandatory, like correct selection of anti-call lights, the transponders, weather radar activity, and auto mode selection of throttle, speed brakes, etc. Remember, before or after this point, these activities would not be in order. Coming to the takeoff segments, again, this has been discussed ad infinitum, but still remains very important. Once the takeoff roll or the ground roll part of the takeoff is complete, we have 4 segments of takeoff. The first segment starts at about 35 feet, speed of V2, and when the selection of landing gear is done from down to retracted position. This segment ends once the landing gear is fully locked up. Here the power setting is at max takeoff power on the good engine. Remember, all this is being calculated for failure of your critical engine. So assuming that the critical engine has failed, you have continued with the takeoff, you have rotated, and now you're climbing out. Your speed should be at V2, the landing gear coming up, and some positive climb gradient available to you. The moment the landing gear locks up, the first segment is over. The next segment, which is considered to be the most critical of all the 4 segments, is the second segment. Here your configuration is landing gear up, and you're climbing from the point where it locked up to your minimum safety height of at least 400 feet. Here you're maintaining the speed of V2. Your flaps are still in takeoff position, and you're maintaining max takeoff power. And regulatory requirements for twin engine aircraft mandate that you should get a minimum climb gradient of 2.4%. Once you reach your safety height, that is the end point of this segment. In practice, it is assumed that if the aircraft performance meets second segment conditions, all other segments will be automatically met because this is the most critical. All certification is done keeping this in mind. The third segment is where you start cleaning up your aircraft further to retract the flaps to the clean or the climb position. And once you get your ISV climb, you reduce your power from the max takeoff power to the max continuous power. And here you are expected to have an equivalent of 1.2% of climb gradient at least. Once you have changed your configuration, got your speed, and changed your power settings, that ends the third segment, while the fourth segment takes you further with max continuous power, retracted flaps, and a speed of ISV climb to climbing to a height of 1,500 feet above ground with at least a 1.2% climb gradient. At this point, that is 1,500 feet, max continuous power, ISV climb, and the flaps retracted, you have completed your takeoff segments. Before I end this session, I would like to define V1. All the commercial jet operations or turboprop operations have been there for the last 50 to 60 years. There's still some ambiguity in the interpretation of the words used to define V1. Theoretically, when we are testing an aircraft and we are certifying it, the V1 is determined from, and I quote, the pilot's application of the first retarding means during the accelerate stop test, which means V1 is neither the decision speed nor the engine failure recognition speed. Because in both these conditions, by the time you start applying the first retarding means, your speed would be higher than the speed you recognize it, which means a higher than V1 speed. The certified accelerate stop distance is based on the average line pilot recognizing the engine failure and beginning the subsequent sequence of stopping actions. It can also be said when the average pilot transits from the takeoff mode to the stopping mode. This entire period gap is in excess of 1 second. 1 second is a regulatory requirement, and now to bring in the average line pilot, a little additional time is added. So V1 is actually the speed, which is when the pilot first recognizes a failure, starts taking the action, and takes the first action to stop the aircraft. I hope I have been a little clear in this. Reaching 1500 feet after takeoff at climb speed marks the end of the takeoff phase and is followed by the departure phase. We shall discuss this in the next episode. Until then,